So, listen to this. England has one of the most technically complete players of his generation. A player shaped by Pep Guardiola, trusted in the most complex system in football, and already a multiple-time champion before his prime. And yet, every time he plays for England, something feels off. Not wrong, not bad, just missing. Like a story where the main character never quite shows up. Everyone agrees he's brilliant, no one doubts his talent, but when the biggest moments come, when England needs someone to take control, to define the game, it's never really him. And that's the part no one can explain. How can a player be so perfect and still feel so invisible? At first, this looks like a simple football problem. Maybe he's being played out of position, maybe the system doesn't suit him, maybe he just hasn't had his moment yet. That's the easy explanation. But the deeper you look, the less it makes sense. Because this isn't really about Phil Foden struggling for England, it's about something much more uncomfortable. It's about how a team chooses its identity, and who gets to be at the centre of it. At Manchester City, everything is structured, every movement calculated, every role designed to bring out the best in him. But international football doesn't work like that. It's slower, more emotional, more dependent on narrative than precision. And sometimes, it's not about who is the most talented, it's about who the team believes in. And that's where everything starts to change for Foden. Phil Foden was never supposed to be this kind of player. Not loud, not dominant, not the one demanding attention. He came through at Manchester City as something quieter, something more subtle. A player who didn't force the game to revolve around him, but instead understood how to exist perfectly within it. From a young age there were signs, the way he received the ball, always half a step ahead, the way he moved, not just reacting, but anticipating. It wasn't flashy in the traditional sense, it was controlled, almost surgical. And that's exactly why Pep Guardiola trusted him. Under Pep, Foden didn't just improve, he evolved. He learned how to play multiple roles, how to drift between spaces, how to become whatever the system needed at any given moment. Left wing, central midfield, false nine, it didn't matter. He adapted, and more importantly, he thrived. Season after season, he became more complete, more intelligent, more reliable. Not just a talent anymore, but a player you could build around. Or at least, that's what it looked like. Because while everything at club level was becoming clearer, more defined, more structured, something very different was waiting for him at international level. But then, everything changed the moment he stepped into the England setup. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, almost quietly. The same player who looked so natural at Manchester City suddenly felt uncertain. Not because he lacked ability, but because the environment around him was completely different. At City, every movement had purpose. Every pass had intention. Every player knew exactly where the other would be. But with England, that clarity wasn't always there. The structure was looser, the rhythm less defined, and the roles far less certain. And that's where the problem began. Because Phil Foden isn't the kind of player who imposes himself on chaos. He doesn't grab the ball and force the game to bend around him. He reads, he adapts, he connects. But what happens when there's nothing clear to connect to? What happens when the system doesn't revolve around control, but around moments, personalities, and individual narratives? Slowly, almost without anyone noticing, Foden started to drift. Not physically, but within the team itself. He was there, involved, touching the ball, making runs, but never quite at the centre of things. While Harry Kane remained the leader, the focal point everyone looked to, and Bukayo Saka brought consistency on the right, and later Jude Bellingham emerged as the emotional heartbeat of the team, Foden found himself in between roles. Not quite the creator, not quite the finisher, not quite the main outlet, just there. And the more the team evolved, the clearer it became. England wasn't lacking talent. In fact, they had too much of it. But instead of building a system that maximized everyone, they built a structure around certain profiles. Players who could carry narrative, who could define moments, who could become symbols. And Foden, for all his technical brilliance, didn't naturally fit that mold. It wasn't that he was playing badly. That was never really the issue. The performances weren't disastrous. The numbers weren't embarrassing. But football at this level isn't just about being good, it's about being necessary. And that was the uncomfortable question starting to form. Not, is Foden good enough, but is Foden essential to this team? At least, that's what it started to look like. But the real story was only just beginning. Because when you actually look closer, the numbers, the moments, the reality on the pitch, the story becomes even more confusing. At Manchester City, Foden isn't just part of the system, he's one of the reasons it works. Season after season, he contributes goals, assists, key passes, movements that don't show up on stats, but completely change how the game flows. There are matches where he disappears from the highlight reels, yet dominates the rhythm of the entire game. That's the kind of player he is. Subtle, efficient, almost invisible until you really understand what you're watching. But then he puts on the England shirt, and suddenly those same qualities don't translate the same way. Not because they disappear, but because they aren't being activated. You'll see flashes, a quick turn under pressure, a perfectly weighted pass, a smart movement into space that no one else even notices. But those moments don't build into anything bigger. They don't become the foundation of the team's play. They just exist. Take the major tournaments, games where everything is supposed to be clearer, sharper, more defined. Instead, Foden often looks like he's searching, not for form, but for purpose. He drifts between the left side, sometimes central, occasionally deeper, but never in a role that feels fully his. And because of that, the game never truly flows through him. The ball doesn't return to him again and again. The responsibility doesn't naturally shift in his direction. Meanwhile, other players step into that space. Harry Kane drops deep, dictating tempo, linking play, becoming the reference point. Bukayo Saka stays wide, direct, consistent, always offering an outlet. And then there's Jude Bellingham, who doesn't just play well, he defines moments. He scores, he celebrates, he demands attention. He becomes the story of the match. And in modern football, that matters more than people like to admit. Because international football isn't just about structure, it's about identity. It's about who the team looks to when things get difficult. And over time, England made their choice. Not explicitly, not in a meeting or a tactical board discussion, but through patterns, through decisions, through moments. The ball goes to Kane, the energy flows through Bellingham, the width belongs to Saka, and Foden fits around them. Even the tactical adjustments reflect it. When things aren't working, he's often the one moved, shifted, or taken off. Not because he's the worst player on the pitch, but because he's the easiest to replace within that structure. He's flexible, adaptable, capable of playing multiple roles. Ironically, the very qualities that make him elite at club level make him less essential at international level. And that's where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. You have a player who, under the most demanding tactical system in club football, thrives because of his intelligence and adaptability. But in a less rigid, more emotionally driven international setup, those same traits make him less defined, less central, less necessary. There are even moments where you can see it in his body language. Not frustration in the obvious sense, not visible anger or complaints, but something quieter, a hesitation, a split-second delay before making a run, as if he's not entirely sure if the ball will come. A glance around, checking positioning, adjusting, recalibrating. These are tiny details, but at the highest level, they matter. Because the difference between being involved and being influential is often just a fraction of a second. And then comes the media narrative, the conversations that start forming outside the pitch. He hasn't done enough. He needs to step up. Where is the real Foden for England? But those questions, as loud as they sound, miss something fundamental. They assume the problem is individual. That if he just tried harder, played better, demanded more, everything would change. But what if that's not how this works? What if the system itself never truly asked him to be that player? Because when you look at it honestly, Foden isn't failing. He's just not being positioned to succeed in the way people expect. And that's a much more complicated problem. One that doesn't have an easy solution. One that forces you to rethink not just the player, but the entire structure around him. But then, there's another way to look at all of this, and it changes everything. Maybe the problem was never Phil Foden. Not his performances, not his mentality, not even the way he's being used. Maybe the real issue is something much deeper, something far less comfortable to admit. Because what if England doesn't actually need a player like him? At Manchester City, Foden is valuable because the system demands intelligence, precision, and constant adaptation. The entire structure is built to reward players who understand space, timing, and subtle movement. It's a system where the best player isn't always the most visible one, but the one who connects everything together. And in that environment, Foden is perfect. But international football is different. It's not always about control. It's not always about structure. More often than not, it's about moments, about personalities, about players who can impose themselves on a game, not just fit into it. And England, over time, has leaned into that. They've built around leaders, around emotional figures, around players who can define a match in a single action. And that's where Foden becomes complicated. Because he doesn't force himself into the spotlight. He doesn't demand the ball every second. He doesn't reshape the game around his presence. Instead, he enhances what's already there. But if the system isn't built around him, then what exactly is he enhancing? Suddenly, everything starts to make sense. It's not that England doesn't trust him, it's that they don't rely on him. And those two things, while similar on the surface, are completely different. Trust means you believe in a player. Reliance means you build around them. And England has already made its choice on who they build around. So maybe this was never a story about a talented player being misused. Maybe it's about a player whose greatest strength doesn't translate in a system that never truly needed it. And when you step back from just Phil Foden, the story starts to feel much bigger than one player. Because this isn't the first time football has seen something like this. A player perfectly suited to one system, struggling to find meaning in another. Not because of a drop in quality, but because of a mismatch in identity. Modern football loves to talk about versatility, about players who can do everything, who can adapt, who can fit anywhere. But what it doesn't always admit is that the more adaptable a player becomes, the less defined they sometimes are. And at the highest level, definition matters. Teams don't just need talent, they need clarity. They need roles that everyone understands without thinking. International football, more than anything, is built on that clarity. There's less time to train, less time to refine patterns, less time to build complex systems. So teams lean into simplicity, into players who represent something obvious: the leader, the finisher, the creator, the fighter. These are not just roles on the pitch, they are roles in the story the team tells about itself. And England, over the years, has been searching for that story. A team full of talent, constantly trying to define who they are. And when they started to find it, when certain players began to embody clear identities, everything became more stable. Kane as the anchor, Bellingham as the driving force, Saka as the reliable outlet. Each of them represents something easy to understand, easy to trust, easy to build around. But where does that leave someone like Foden? A player who doesn't simplify the game, but refines it. A player who doesn't represent one clear idea, but many at once. In a system that values clarity over complexity, that kind of profile becomes harder to place. Not because it's worse, but because it's harder to define. And maybe that's the uncomfortable truth modern football doesn't like to admit. That sometimes being the most complete player in the squad doesn't make you the most important one. Makes you the easiest to move around. And then the moment comes when everything becomes clear. Not in one single match, not in one obvious mistake, but in a pattern that repeats itself until it's impossible to ignore. Big games, big stages, the kind of nights where players don't just perform, they define themselves. You watch England in those moments and you start to see who the game gravitates towards. The ball finds Kane when control is needed. It moves through Bellingham when energy and presence take over. It reaches Saka when directness becomes the solution. And Foden is still there, still moving, still connecting, still doing everything right, but never quite becoming the centre of it all. There are flashes, of course, moments where you catch a glimpse of what could be. A quick turn in a tight space, a perfectly timed run that almost changes everything. A pass that should have led to something bigger. But almost is a dangerous place to live in football, because at this level, the players who define their legacy are the ones who turn those moments into certainty. And slowly, without anyone explicitly saying it, the hierarchy settles. Not based purely on talent, but on impact, on presence, on narrative. The team begins to move in a way that feels natural to them. And in that movement, Foden becomes something he was never meant to be: a supporting character. Not because he isn't good enough to be more, but because everything around him has already decided where the spotlight belongs. And once that spotlight settles, it's incredibly hard to take it back. And maybe That's the part that makes this story so difficult to fully accept. Because nothing about it feels like a failure. Phil Foden didn't collapse under pressure. He didn't disappear because of poor form. He didn't fall short in the way people usually expect. Instead, he became something much more complicated. A player who does almost everything right in a team that doesn't need him to be everything. A player whose intelligence, whose subtlety, whose ability to connect the game never quite turns into ownership of it. In another system, in another version of this England team, maybe things look completely different. Maybe the play flows through him. Maybe the responsibility shifts in his direction. Maybe he becomes the one everything is built around. But football doesn't work in hypotheticals. It works in moments, in decisions, in identities that form over time. And England has already found theirs. So the question isn't whether Phil Foden is good enough. It never really was. The question is much simpler and much harder at the same time. Not, can he be the main character, but was he ever meant to be one here?